Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Getty, and I have a lot of appreciation for the American political system. It's seen us through for over 200 years so far. That's a long time for a form of government. Just as a point of comparison, France had their revolution in 1789. That's the same year the US Constitution went into effect, and France is already on Republic number 5. But as we all know, things are not perfect, and I want to talk about some of the problems with the American political system. I'm utilizing the Iceberg format to talk about some of the more obvious and well-known problems with the American political system at the start. And then as the video continues on, we'll go deeper on the iceberg towards less obvious and more esoteric stuff that you may not have considered before or just may not know much about. Oh, and I should say that I obviously do have political opinions. Check out my previous videos if you want to know what those are, but this video is about the big systemic things that I think a lot of people would probably agree are at least somewhat of a problem. Okay. Let's go. Starting at the top of the iceberg, I tried to pick some of the more common things that I hear from people whenever they talk about what's wrong with American politics. If you follow politics at all, you've probably heard these things said at least, but hopefully I can explain what they all are in a little more depth. First is a big one, money in politics. I'm dividing this into two parts, legal money in politics and more straightforward, already illegal corruption and bribery. In terms of actual corruption and bribery, it does happen. Disgraced former Senator Bob Menendez was convicted of accepting actual gold bars from the Egyptian government, for example. And there was a famous investigation into congressional corruption in the 1980s called Abscam that resulted in several members of Congress being convicted of corruption-related crimes. Subscribers to this channel might remember the interview I did with Noah Widman, a candidate for U.S. House running against a representative named Corey Mills, who's under investigation for profiting off of federal arms contracts while in office. All this is obviously terrible, but whenever people talk about money in politics, what they're usually talking about is something else. In the United States, candidates need your money. This is why robots claiming to be Nancy Pelosi text you 5 times a week, and why spam emails claiming to be from Donald Trump are robbing the nation's elderly people. The sheer amount of money in politics is mind-boggling. The average winning candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives spends almost $3 million, and the average winning candidate for U.S. Senate spends about $26 million. The Harris and Trump campaigns raised more than $3 billion in the last cycle. This isn't even counting donations made to aligned political action committees. We'll get to what that means in a second. More money doesn't always guarantee more success. For example, Harris raised more than Trump in the last election, but you do need at least some money to be competitive, especially if you're a candidate that people aren't already familiar with. All that money gets spent on advertisements, campaign staffers, consultants, yard signs, everything that makes the campaign function. You might have heard about political action committees or PACs. Whenever you hear criticisms of PACs, you're almost always hearing criticisms of what's known as a super PAC, because traditional PACs are significantly more regulated. Super PACs came into existence with the famous Supreme Court case. That's right, Citizens United versus FEC, which held that organizations like corporations, unions, and advocacy groups like the group Citizens United had a First Amendment free speech right to spend as much money as they wanted on political messaging. The only significant restriction on super PACs is that they aren't allowed to directly coordinate with or directly donate to candidates or political parties. This doesn't stop them from being incredibly influential, though. Take a look at a section from this ad.
Jamal Bowman has his own agenda and refuses to compromise, even with President Biden. Bowman voted against the President's Infrastructure Act, against rebuilding roads and bridges in New York, against replacing lead pipes. And Jamal Bowman voted against President Biden's debt limit deal, putting Social Security and Medicare payments at risk, along with our entire economy. Jamal Bowman has his own agenda, and he's hurting New York. UDP's responsible for the content of this ad.
This is a recently somewhat infamous example of super PAC activity in which a super PAC called United Democracy Project, which is affiliated with AIPAC, a pro-Israel lobbying group, ran ads that had nothing to do with a candidate's position on Israel in order to try and defeat candidates that AIPAC thought were not pro-Israel enough. It isn't just AIPAC that does this, to be clear, but they made headlines for it relatively recently because the candidate they were targeting, Jamal Bowman, did in fact lose his primary to Representative George Latimer. The last thing I'll say about money in politics is that in addition to the obvious problems, it also makes our legislators worse at their jobs because they have to spend a huge amount of time fundraising. It varies by representative, so it's hard to generalize, but I can assure you that even if the money isn't corrupting them, it is depriving them of time that could be spent actually doing their jobs. The question on everybody's mind when it comes to money in politics is, what is this money actually buying? One of the things it can buy is access. This leads me to a Related topic on the iceberg, lobbying. I used to work in what's called government relations, and I can tell you that a lot of the lobbying that goes on isn't on those big ticket issues. It's on issues that you've probably never even thought of before, like which medical devices are covered by Medicare, just as an example. These issues are small for the government, so small that it's practically a guarantee that most members of Congress have never even considered them before, but they can be life or death for a lot of companies or organizations or what have you. So how do you make sure the Congress people are aware that the bill that they're passing might accidentally put your business out of business? Well, you can hire a lobbyist who will then pay $1,000 to attend a campaign fundraising dinner on your behalf, where they, or maybe even you, if you've got the skill to do it, will get the chance to tell the honorable representative who you are and what you're so concerned about. Not directly buying votes, not saying we'll give you $1,000 if you vote this way, but it sure feels crooked, doesn't it? Tangential to the question of lobbying is the concept of the revolving door, which refers to the phenomenon of politicians, regulatory agency employees, lobbyists, and occasionally corporate people rotating in and out of different jobs in any of these fields. This is something that's very common because of how important personal relationships are to all of these fields, but it's also something that's criticized because it creates opportunities for corruption and conflicts of interest. Let's move on to another big topic, age. It's no secret that our politics is getting older. The median age of the House of Representatives is 57, and it's 64 in the Senate. Obviously, this is wildly out of step with the American median age of around 38. Aside from just being unrepresentative, this is a problem for a couple reasons. The first is that it can sometimes be difficult for people who have been working as career politicians since before the first iPhone came out to understand a lot of the challenges of the modern day.
Well, if so, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see.
The other more obvious problem is that there have been several high-profile cases over the last few years of elected officials hanging on to their seats well past the point where I think it could be considered responsible for them to do so. I don't mean to be rude. This is very personally tragic stuff in a lot of cases, but this one is at least somewhat personal to me as well. My former representative, Kay Granger, was in office with dementia, and unbeknownst to anyone except her family and probably some of her office staff, was not actually doing her job as a representative, but was in fact in a memory care facility. She was 81 at the time, and the only reason that anyone found this out was because she was found wandering around town. I feel very deeply sorry for her personally and for her family, but I and everyone who lives in my district was effectively deprived of representation during this period, and that's absolutely unacceptable. It's not surprising that so many elected officials hold on to their seats for so long, in addition to a tendency for Congress people to accumulate more power as they accumulate seniority. The job becomes life for them. It's their whole identity. They've been doing it for years and years and years, and it's hard to give it up. Next up is partisanship. When we complain about partisanship, what we usually mean is that American politics has become more bitter, angry, and polarized. Certainly, we've become more polarized. The Republican and Democratic parties used to both contain some conservatives and liberals, but over time, and especially since the 90s, the two parties have become much more ideologically sorted. These days, the term liberal Republican sounds like an oxymoron. This is one of the reasons why working across the aisle has become much more difficult than it used to be. This creates problems in a system like ours where getting almost anything of substance done in Congress requires 60 senators agreeing to it. Partisanship is also sometimes what we say whenever we're talking about the way that supporters of a political party will sacrifice all of their credibility, or at least a lot of what they believe in order to support their team. I'm sure you can think of a million examples of this happening. One important example that most people have never heard of is an essay that maybe I'll devote a whole video to one day by Michael Anton, current Trump administration official, called The Flight 93 Election, which was published in the lead up to the 2016 election. The essay was an impassioned plea for conservatives to put aside the worries that they might have about Trump as a person and to get on board because the stakes were so high. It was influential on the right and probably one of the most important instances of truly partisan politics that almost nobody has ever heard of. We'll talk more about some of the potential causes of partisanship later in the video, so consider this just an introduction to an important concept that is often cited as one of the essential problems with American politics. On to the second layer of the iceberg, and we're talking about the media. You hear complaints about the media from all corners of politics. Why is this? Well, to start, we put a lot of our trust in the media. Not only does the media keep us apprised of what's happening all over the country, all over the world, really, but because there's so much news happening at any given time, we also trust the media to be sort of a filter and to only give us the most important, relevant, and newsworthy information. We can't make informed decisions about what issues to prioritize or who to vote for without the media. And so in some sense, it's pretty natural, I think, that whenever we sense something is wrong with our politics, we might look to the media for someone to blame. One of the most defining features of the news and the media in the 21st century has been an explosion of choice. Don't like what the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal has to say? Try MSNBC or Fox News. Not engaged by Rachel Maddow, here's an essentially infinite number of social media personalities you can follow. To the extent that this explosion of choice has allowed people to better express themselves, I think that's a good thing. After all, here you are listening to me. This laptop that this video is being filmed on right now is literally propped up on a stack of books. Social media has given me the opportunity to reach so many people without a whole professional setup. At the same time, I think we need to be aware of how the media we consume shapes us. There was an interesting article by the Financial Times that analyzed how frequently extremist views were represented on traditional media, on cable TV, and on social media. As you can see, the further we get from traditional media, those boring old newspapers, the more likely you are to get extremist content. So while I think there definitely are some legitimate grievances to be had with the traditional media, there's a sort of parallel problem with social media. No barriers to entry, no editors, no fact checkers might mean more instant gratification and more ability to see content that confirms what you already believe. But it also means you're going to be seeing a lot more content that just wouldn't be published by anyone with actual standards. And this has consequences. A lot of people wholeheartedly believe some insane stuff that they would have had no idea about if not for Facebook or whatever. One of the challenges of the 21st century, I think, is going to be figuring out how to get people reliable information in an age where more and more people are consuming media delivered to them by algorithms trying to maximize for engagement and not necessarily for the truth or newsworthiness or any of those boring old editorial standards. Y'all probably thought that was going to be a segue into a ground news ad at any moment there, huh? No sponsor. My channel is not big enough to have sponsors, but I will ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave me a comment telling me what you would do to fix any of these problems or some problems with American politics that I missed in this video. I'm getting so close to 10,000 subscribers, and that would be a really awesome milestone to reach. Okay, back to the video. The filibuster is something you see thrown around as a cause of political dysfunction in the United States, but how many of you actually know what it is? So if you were to look up how many votes does it take to pass a bill in the Senate, you'll see that it takes a simple majority, 51 votes. But hold on, earlier you heard me say that getting things done in the Senate requires 60 votes. What's that about? Well, that's because the Senate is kind of like a bar with a really high cover charge, but they give you 2 drink tickets after you pay. The Senate, unlike the House of Representatives, does not limit the amount of time that something can be debated for. And it actually takes 60 votes in order to invoke cloture and end the debate before the Senate can actually officially vote on something. So in effect, it takes 60 votes to get most things through the Senate. The filibuster was created basically accidentally when Aaron Burr, yes, that Aaron Burr, decided he wanted to clean up the Senate rulebook and eliminated a motion that allowed a simple majority of senators to cut off debate and proceed to the vote. The classic image of the filibuster is a guy standing for hours and hours talking and talking, because in the Senate, as long as you're talking, no one can make you stop. And if no one's willing to keep talking after you sit down, the bill you're trying to protest can move on to an actual vote.
And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause, even if this room gets filled with lies like these. And the tailors and all their armies come marching into this place. Somebody will listen to me.
In reality, though, ever since the 70s, this sort of romantic idea we have about the filibuster has mostly been killed off by rules changes that allow senators to effectively filibuster legislation without actually holding the floor. This is called the silent filibuster, and it makes it much easier for the minority to stop legislation. This specific version of the filibuster is what's really entrenched the effective 60-vote requirement for most things to pass through the Senate. The really funny thing about this is that since the filibuster is a product of just the Senate rules and not the Constitution or anything, it would only take 51 votes to remove the filibuster. Using the rules to do this in the Senate is called the nuclear option. If you're really into politics, you're probably aware of first past the post voting. This is a fancy way to say whoever gets the most votes wins. That's how we do our elections in the United States for the most part, And it sounds pretty intuitive, right? The problem comes in whenever you add a third-party candidate to the mix, because the first-past-the-post system says that the candidate with the most votes wins, even if they don't necessarily get a majority. Voting for a third-party candidate you prefer means that the candidate you prefer least actually has a better shot at winning. This is why, for instance, in 2024, a GOP-aligned super PAC donated money to boost Jill Stein's Green Party in close states, because the thinking is Green Party voters, if they don't vote for the Green Party, are more likely to vote for Democrats than Republicans. So boosting the Green Party ends up helping the Republicans. Because the first-past-the-post system works this way, it makes it very likely that a two-party system will emerge, which is why in the United States we've basically always had two dominant political parties. Even whenever it wasn't Republicans and Democrats, it was Whigs and Democrats, or Democratic Republicans and Federalists. The last thing on the second layer of our iceberg is gerrymandering, which refers to strategic drawing of districts so as to give a particular political party an advantage. Gerrymandering has been in the news a lot lately because the Trump administration called on Texas to redraw their congressional maps to ensure that 5 more representatives from Texas would be Republicans. This caused backlash from Democrats, most notably in California, where they're planning a referendum to approve a counter gerrymander to balance out what's happening in Texas. Gerrymandering is named after Elbridge Gerry. Mr. Gerry was at the time governor of Massachusetts, and when redistricting happened, a district was drawn in a way that was biased in favor of the Democratic-Republican Party. Federalist opponents made fun of this by saying that the new district was so contorted that it looked like a salamander. The word salamander was combined with Gerry, and the word gerrymander was born. Today, because in the majority of states, the politicians are the ones that draw the lines, and they obviously have a huge interest in making sure that they keep their own seats and that their party does well in the next elections, practically everyone gerrymanders if they can. I have actually been involved with the drawing of district lines as a former legislative aide in Texas, and I'm just going to say that however bad you think this process is, it is absolutely worse. There is genuinely no fixing this one as long as legislators are involved with the process at all. It's a straightforward conflict of interest. But gerrymandering isn't just bad because it's corrupt. It's bad because it effectively deprives people of real political representation. When you have a city that would otherwise vote for a Democrat broken up into 5 little chunks and diluted with vast swaths of rural land, that means that the people in the city aren't getting to choose someone that represents them as a coherent community. The same thing is true when the reverse happens. It's not right, and it's making our politics much worse. It also means that in most cases, the general elections for Congress don't matter. And what actually matters is the primary election for whatever party is practically guaranteed to win the district in the end. Which brings me to the first topic of the third layer of the problems with American politics iceberg: primary elections. Before elections between the political parties occur, we have elections within the parties to determine who the official candidates are going to be. The United States is somewhat unusual around the world for relying so much on primary elections to choose all sorts of candidates instead of having candidates selected by the party itself. We haven't always had primary elections in the United States either. They only started to take off around the turn of the 20th century, and they didn't really start to matter in presidential elections until the 1960s. Before then, presidential candidates were selected at national conventions by party delegates and with a lot of influence by party bigwigs. Primary elections made our system more democratic in some ways, but they've also interacted with our political system in some ways that aren't exactly ideal. For instance, in the vast majority of congressional races, because of gerrymandering, because there are so few actually competitive districts, the primary election is now the only election that actually matters. In a coherent community that just happens to heavily favor the Republican or Democratic Party, this wouldn't necessarily be a big deal because the true interest of the voters is still more or less being represented. Like, I don't think I would complain too much about the Republican primary being important in a local race in West Texas, or the Democratic primary being important in San Francisco. But when it comes to congressional seats, when, as we can see with how districts are actually drawn, there really is no intent at all to represent coherent, real communities, primary elections are part of a system that essentially disenfranchises both Republicans and Democrats alike if they happen to live in a state controlled by the opposite party. Primary elections in heavily gerrymandered districts have also made it easier for more extreme candidates to win elected office because the people that vote in primary elections are more ideological than people that only vote in the general election. When the only election that matters for an elected official is their party's primary because of gerrymandering, and the plurality of voters in a primary election are devout ideological partisans, it creates a situation where the real constituency of most Congress people is just a fraction of the people that live in their district. Is it any wonder why most people have horrible opinions of Congress as an institution? Everyone knows, I think implicitly, even if you actually like who's representing you at a given moment, that something's wrong with the system here. Moving on, there's another set of lines that really influence our politics that we almost never think about. The state lines. When this country was founded, it was as a union of more or less separate states. States in the sense of like sovereign states. The idea of the Senate is that since all the states had a sort of equality and that they were all in some sense sovereign, there should be a House of Congress that represented the interests of all the states equally. This rationale is laid out by James Madison in Federalist Paper number 39. Accordingly, since the Senate was intended to represent the interests of the states as co-equal societies, senators were chosen by the legislators of the states. But of course, today, senators aren't there as representatives of the state government because they are not elected by the state government. Ever since the 17th Amendment in 1913, they have been elected popularly. The problem this presents for the Senate is that state and regional identities have become much weaker in the United States over time. As more of our politics becomes less local and more nationalized, the Senate awarding more representation to people who just happen to live in certain areas of the country looks a little more arbitrary, especially when there's people subject to the laws of the United States that have a strong identity, that want representation, that don't have it. The salience of this problem is heightened since the Senate isn't just some rubber stamp body that can basically be ignored like the upper houses of legislators in some other countries. The Senate still has a ton of power, and as we discussed earlier, it's often the roadblock for getting legislation passed. This isn't to say that the Senate should or shouldn't be a thing. It's just a prediction that as the identities that made the Senate a thing in the first place continue to become less and less important when compared to the broader American identity, people are more and more going to be questioning how the power the Senate holds is distributed. Okay, now we're moving on to the first of three sections that are about problems with our branches of government, starting with Supreme Court legitimacy. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States, and as such, here's a lot of important decisions. Their decisions are, at least in theory, supposed to be based on what the Constitution says. Pretty simple, right? Not exactly. Polling suggests that 7 in 10 Americans think that the Supreme Court puts ideology over impartiality, and only 3 in 10 Americans think that the justices are more likely to provide an independent check on other branches of government by being fair and impartial. These numbers are pretty much a disaster for the Supreme Court, because if those numbers get too bad for them, if people primarily start to see the Supreme Court as an instrument of partisan politics rather than at least a somewhat impartial interpreter of what the law is and what the Constitution says, it's really only a matter of time before it becomes fully subsumed as an institution into partisan politics, with different administrations and Congresses attempting to pack the court or change it to fit their needs in some way. People often think about court packing from the left, since the Supreme Court leans more conservative right now. But we've also seen some of this from the right. Here's J.D. Vance talking about how the president should just ignore the court if he needs to.
And then when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Because this is, I think, a constitutional level crisis.
If there's any reform to the Supreme Court that could be done in order to raise its legitimacy in the eyes of the American public, I think that needs to be a much more serious priority than I sense that it is right now. Because a judicial branch that people can trust is so critical to the rule of law and the whole American system of government. Different reform ideas for the Supreme Court, I think, might be an interesting video all on its own. Let me know if you'd like to see that, or if there's anything else that you're interested in. This plays into the larger problem of judicial legitimacy in general. In addition to comments Trump has made about the judicial system, those aren't a secret or surprising to anyone at this point. Stephen Miller, one of the most important advisors to President Trump, has consistently talked about how lower court judges are engaged in a concerted effort to disrupt the Trump administration. Not great for judicial legitimacy. Moving on to executive power. The President of the United States is one of, if not the most powerful person in the world. The office of the president within the United States has also gotten a lot more powerful recently. I made a video a while back about the expansion of executive power over the last 50 years or so check that out for more of a deep dive, but I'll give the short version here. In the mid-century, there were a lot of people who were frustrated by the growth of the administrative state and various social programs under presidents like FDR and Johnson. However, there was never really a way for opponents of all this to gut it in Congress. There was never enough votes. So enter a novel theory of executive power called the unitary executive theory, which in short says that since these agencies created by Congress are under the executive branch, the president could actually do a lot more with them than a lot of people previously thought, like, for example, firing people and appointing political loyalists. The theory has developed over time, and while it began within the conservative legal movement and has seen its strongest explicit defenders with George Bush and Donald Trump, no president has been eager to give up power that's been handed to him. Today, this is what the unitary executive theory sounds like.
Then I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president, but I don't even talk about that.
This obviously presents a problem for an American system that depends on checks and balances, but really this type of executive overreach is only possible because of the next iceberg item, a feeble Congress. Basically, all the problems that I laid out in the last two sections have a common denominator, which is a Congress that is unwilling or unable to do anything about any of them. Congress is supposed to be the branch of government that makes law. If a constitutional amendment needs to be made and sent to the states for approval, that happens in Congress. If a bill needs to be passed in order to clarify something that the courts have ruled was too vague, that happens in Congress. If the executive branch is overstepping its bounds and needs to be restrained, that happens in Congress too. Our form of government was created with the idea that the different branches, the different centers of power would guard their influence jealously. Our founders took for granted the idea that Congress would have some sense of itself as an institution and not just as an extension of the party in power. Time and time again, over decades, Congress has chosen to offload responsibilities to the executive branch, from wide-ranging powers to impose tariffs simply by claiming that there's an emergency, to the ability to use the military essentially at the president's whim. The powers to wage war and to raise taxes. These are absurdly important things that Congress has decided that they, in certain instances, just don't want the responsibility of dealing with. The weakness of Congress is only multiplied by several of the things that we've already talked about, like the silent filibuster, making it practically impossible for legislation of significance to get through the Senate, or the fact that it's very difficult for most members of Congress to break ranks for something that they really believe in without facing a primary challenge from someone who's willing to toe the line more consistently in a ridiculously gerrymandered district. Moving on to the fourth layer of the iceberg, this is where things start to get pretty esoteric. The first thing that I want to talk about is shared reality destruction. It is becoming easier and easier for people to feel like they are politically engaged while consuming essentially a funhouse mirror version of the world, filtered through sophisticated social media algorithms designed to maximize for engagement rather than any sort of standard of evidence, newsworthiness, or quality. We talked about this some earlier whenever I talked about social media, but I wanted to come back to it here because I think the implications are deeper than just exposure to more extreme politics. Do you remember this clip?
Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Alternative facts?
This clip, even if it was just a vocal flub, literally haunts my brain. The idea that such a thing as alternative facts is even comprehensible. The idea that we really can't come to any sort of objective understanding of reality. It's a pretty scary thought for me personally. Emotion and feeling is always going to play a role in politics. That's unavoidable, and I don't even know if it would be good to avoid it. However, giving people the ability to consciously, or in many cases unconsciously, choose their own reality of facts to consume and build their reality around, as social media companies do whatever they can to understand what you will watch the most, magnifies the challenge of maintaining an informed and educated public in a well-functioning democracy. It's interesting to read earlier political thinkers and what they say about how important education is to a well-functioning democracy. And I agree, education is incredibly important, but I think to some extent, what we've really learned recently is that endless information does not equate to an education. Moving right along, do you ever think that it's strange that the only way to fire the most powerful man in the world is to convict him of a crime or to get his closest advisors to turn on him? What if he's just bad at the job but isn't a criminal? What if he becomes bad at the job, but his advisors won't turn on him because they are putting the well-being of their careers above the well-being of the country? These are problems that aren't addressed by our current system of government, and I think it's worth considering what that means for our political system. In other countries, ones with parliamentary systems, their executive doesn't generally need to be convicted of a crime in an inherently political trial in order to be removed from office. Speaking generally here, since I don't know how every parliamentary system in the world functions, but if a prime minister loses the support of the majority of parliament, they can be removed from office with a vote of no confidence. The fact that in the United States we have to impeach the president and then convict him of high crimes and misdemeanors, whatever that means, in order to get rid of him, in my opinion, makes things much more complicated and dramatic than they really need to be. If the president is a crook, if he's committed a crime, let him be convicted in a court of law after he's out of office. He's a citizen. If the president has lost the confidence of a significant amount of Congress for whatever reason and needs to go, let's skip all the drama about what high crimes and misdemeanors is. Let's stop pretending like impeachments can be fundamentally divorced from the political process when it's a trial of a politician by politicians in a fundamentally political forum. In terms of the problems that this poses for democracy, I think the opaque nature of what exactly an impeachable offense is, combined with the unnecessary legal posturing that surrounds this whole procedure, combined with the fact that no president has ever actually successfully been removed after an impeachment, despite several of them probably deserving it, has inadvertently given rise to this idea that the president is above the law.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
This kind of thinking, in my opinion, is just so utterly corrosive to the idea of equality before the law, which is one of the pillars of a functioning free democratic republic. One more thing about the president. One of the other problems that our system of government sets up for us is that we have two branches of government that can feasibly claim to have some sort of democratic mandate. You hear often about the people delivering a mandate for whoever wins on election night. The idea here is the people have said, yes, we want this, to the president's agenda, which implies that the president must have some sort of right to act in their name in order to implement that agenda. Recently, the Trump administration has been eager to claim that his democratic mandate is being undermined in various ways. But of course, the executive branch isn't the only part of government with a democratic mandate. Congress is also elected. Congress is also representative in a way that the president can never be, since Congress contains within it and grants certain rights even to the minority. The minority can still write bills, still serve on committees, and we've already talked about what they can get up to in the Senate. So the question is, if the people are sovereign, and we believe in the idea of popular sovereignty, does the president or does Congress have a better claim to be the definitive voice of the people? This is an especially relevant question to ask, I think, when, as we've already discussed, the office of the president has so much power. Can one man claim to represent the will of all the people when he can be elected by less than half of the people? Can Congress claim to represent the will of the people in a coherent way if they can never manage to speak with one voice? I think it's difficult to say, and I think conflict between the democratic mandates of Congress and the democratic mandate of the president is going to be something to look out for if we ever get to a point, maybe even in 2026, if things go badly for the Republicans, where both houses of Congress are controlled by one party and the presidency is controlled by the other. Speaking of Congress, I want to talk about what the point of representation is. What is the job of a representative? When I say a representative here, I'm talking about anyone who's elected to represent other people in a political office. At first, this seems like another really easy question to answer. A representative should try and represent the people that voted for them. The problem is in determining exactly what it means to represent someone. Let's say that you're elected to go to Congress. You know that the bill that you're about to vote on, the happiness and fun bill, will make the lives of the people in your district better in the long run. But because you're elected by the good people of Miserable,ville, you know that your constituents think that they want nothing to do with happiness or fun. So what do? Do you support the best interests of your constituents and vote for the happiness and fun bill? Or do you support their opinions on the issue and vote against it? This is what I mean when I talk about the situation being a little more complicated than it seems. How people answer this question has incredibly important implications for how our politics function, especially since today We live in an age of public opinion polling where politicians have access to powerful tools to try and approximate what the voters are thinking about any given issue. This gets even more complicated whenever we consider that some representatives exercise powers beyond the districts that elected them. Your representatives in Congress, for example, make decisions that impact the entire country. Are they obligated to take any of the other people of the United States into account whenever they make decisions while representing you? If you're interested in this topic, I touch on it in this video. Feel free to check it out. Moving on to the final level of the iceberg, I have two concepts here that I think are really important to the health of the American political system, but they're also things that are almost never talked about. So I really want to talk about them here. The first one is cynicism. I think cynicism, nihilism, doomerism, any ism like that is one of the great challenges of this generation, and it impacts our relationship to politics. For sure, there's stuff worth being cynical about. I mean, obviously, right? We just went through a whole bunch of problems with the American political system. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that generations before us have also had it bad and come out of it. You think the spiritual malaise of the 2020s is bad? Can you imagine living to see 2 world wars? Things looked really bad there for a while. True economic collapse, authoritarian ideologies on the march, everywhere. Liberal democracy was very much on the edge, but we were able to come out of it. The point that I really want to make here is that the political system fundamentally doesn't work if we don't believe that things getting better is possible. We need to believe that things can get better for everyone. Otherwise, everything becomes a zero-sum battle for scraps. There's a category of phrases called thought-terminating cliches, things you say in a discussion to stop thinking, things like, it is what it is, stuff like that. One of the ones that flies around all the time online is nothing ever happens. In the kind of multi-layered irony verse of online politics, it's sometimes hard to tell when people are using this as a joke and when people are being serious with it. But I know at least some people are being serious with it. And I think this entire nihilistic mentality that I see all the time among young people engaging with politics online is awful. It's really, really bad. Nothing ever happened without some people believing that something could happen. If too many people believe that nothing will ever get better, nothing ever will get better. And that includes every single thing that we've talked about in this video. Check out my video on Gen Z if you want to hear some more developed thoughts on this. The last thing on my problems with American politics iceberg is a concept that is tragically underconsidered in contemporary political conversation, and it is the concept of civic virtue. Civic virtue is all the qualities of people that make them good members of a political community. It's an absolutely indispensable part of the American political system. You hear all the time this idea that rights come with responsibilities. Civic virtue, to me, is the responsibilities part of that equation. You have the right to vote and you have the responsibility to make informed choices. We have a right to a free press. I think that should make news outlets feel a certain responsibility to a standard of ethics. And I think that should make news consumers feel a responsibility in supporting outlets that they think are living up to that standard. Recognizing that no man is an island and that all citizens have certain responsibilities in a free society is absolutely necessary in order to maintain a free society. There's a quote by Rousseau that I like that longtime viewers have heard me use before. He's talking about the different kinds of law necessary for a functioning political community. He says, the most important law is not graven on tablets of marble or brass, but on the hearts of the citizens. This forms the real constitution of the state, takes on everyday new powers when other laws decay or die out, restores them or takes their place, keeps a people in the ways in which it was meant to go, and insensibly replaces authority by the force of habit. I am speaking of morality, of custom, above all of public opinion, a power unknown to political thinkers, on which nonetheless success in everything else depends. With this, the great legislator concerns himself in secret, though he seems to confine himself to particular regulations, for these are only the arc of the arch, while manners and morals, slower to arise, form in the end its immovable keystone. In more decipherable language, what Rousseau is saying here is that you can write all the laws you want, all the constitutions you want, but none of this will save you if the people don't actually believe in any of it, or if they just don't care. In more classically American language, famously, when Benjamin Franklin was asked what kind of government the Constitutional Convention had created, he said, a republic if you can keep it. To say this kind of thing today, to talk this way today, sounds so utterly naive and anachronistic even. It's unreal. I'm aware of how cringe talking this way sounds, but it's also just true. I can't ignore the fact that I also just think that it's ultimately true. The citizens of a republic have the power. In the end, the people are ultimately sovereign, and we have the responsibility to fix this stuff. There's no institution that we can appeal to that will fix all these problems automatically. And I think that it's pretty clear just from the fact that our political system has so many problems that our current class of leaders right now aren't exactly overflowing with civic virtue themselves. In too many cases, they have tunnel vision for money, for power, for base self-preservation even. Higher ideals like civic virtue are meaningless to them. I think ultimately then it's up to average citizens to renew the American system, to come out of our cocoon of cynicism and to believe in something again, to at the very least believe that things can get better. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. This is a new format for me. Hope you liked it. Don't forget to like the video, comment, subscribe. Okay, I'll see you next time.